Hello and welcome to this lesson on analysing fiction. At this stage of the course, you may find analysing fiction an intimidating task, and it does take some critical thinking. However, we are going to go through each step to help you feel more confident in this area. Fiction texts are created from the imagination and include made-up stories with characters, a setting and plot from the author's own imagination. Some examples of fiction texts would include picture books, novels, and classic fairy tales. Meanwhile, the definition of non-fiction is the term for any writing created with the intention of relaying truth or information of actual events to the audience. This means that it is the opposite of fiction. Non-fiction texts are based on facts and are informative. These include history books, autobiographies, and many more. See these examples of fiction and non-fiction writing to see where you can find the differences between these two forms of writing. Fiction is writing that comes from the writer's imagination. It can be based on history or fact, but needs to be true. Fiction texts are always creative and use language techniques to create meaning and interest for the reader. Fiction can take many forms, such as novels. Novels are books that have one long story written in them. They're works of prose fiction. They're longer than short stories and novellas. A novella is a standalone piece of fiction that's shorter than a full-length novel, but longer than a short story or novelette. Short stories. Short stories are much shorter than a novel, and usually deals with only a few characters. Play scripts. A play or drama script is the story that has been written for actors to perform, with the term play relating to a theatrical performance. Poems. Poems use specifically chosen language, rhythm, rhyme, imagery, and more to create an image or tell a narrative. Poems can be short or as long as a full novel. Genre is the name given to a style or category of literature. There are over 30 genres out there, and here are a few. Not all fiction stories can be easily categorized. Many stories contain elements of two types of fiction, or even more. Think of the Harry Potter series, for example. It's a young adult series, but it's also an adventure story with a central quest. It contains elements of fantasy, with plenty of magic and mythical creatures, and there's also quite a lot of romance. It is also worth pointing out the genre dystopian. A dystopia is an imagined society where life is unpleasant, or bad in some way. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood is an example of a dystopian novel. The protagonist is the main character of the story, and will often undergo some kind of change or development during the course of the story. They do not have to be good or likeable, although in many cases they will be. An antagonist is a character who is in opposition to the protagonist, such as an adversary or enemy. When you are evaluating how successfully a writer has created a character, think about all the different methods the writer has used to reveal that character's personality to the reader. Think about these elements. Physical description. What physical characteristics has the writer chosen to describe, and what language have they used to describe them? Action. How do they act, and what verbs does the writer use to describe their actions? How do other characters react to them? Narrative voice. Is the story told from their perspective? If so, what is the effect of this? Dialogue. How do they speak, and what do they say? How do other characters speak to them? Narrative voice is the voice that tells the story. It could be a character or a more general observer. In fiction text, the narrative voice is not the same as the writer's voice. The writer's choice of narrator and the ways in which the narrator tells the story can have a significant effect on the ways in which the reader responds to the story and its characters. First-person narrator. A character within the story is telling the story. Some of the main personal pronouns used are I, my, me, and we. Second-person narrator. Not commonly used by writers. The personal pronouns you and your are used throughout. Third-person narrator. The story is being told by the voice of someone who is not a character in the story. The main personal pronouns used are she, he, and they. Omniscient narrator. The story is being told by a voice who shows they know more than the characters in the story. The narrator is all-knowing. The main personal pronouns used are she, he, and they. First-person narrators have a limited view of events and may often withhold information or lie. This means that they are unreliable. Writers can use this to create humour. Your critical analysis needs to be detailed and carefully structured. For every point you make, answer these 3 questions. What is the first thing you find out about the plot or the characters in the opening? Is the ending happy, sad, or a cliffhanger? What is the narrative perspective? Who is telling the story? How is the setting described? Is the atmosphere happy, frightening, or comic? What do you learn about the characters? And how do you feel about the characters? Then for each point, ask yourself, how has the writer achieved this? And why did they choose to do it? Grammar. You should use accurate subject terminology when you comment on the writer's language choices. Make sure you can comment in detail on nouns, adjectives, verbs, and adverbs. Patterns in sound. Writers sometimes choose words because of the sound they create when said aloud. This can emphasize key information or involve the reader's hearing in a description to make them feel as though they are really there. Alliteration is when 2 or more words that start with the same sound are used repeatedly in a phrase or a sentence. The repeated sound creates alliteration, not the same letter. For example, tasty tacos is considered an alliteration, but thirsty typists is not, because the and tie don't sound the same. Alliteration is a type of repetition, a repetition of sounds. Sibilance is a type of literary device and figure of speech wherein a hissing sound is created in a group of words through the repetition of a S sound. For example, Sarah's silly sister swallowed her sweets. Assonance. This is when the same vowel sounds are repeated in multiple words. For example, the rain in Spain stays mainly on the plain. The main effect of assonance in literature is to create a sense of rhythm. It helps dictate which syllables should be stressed within a line of text. Onomatopoeia is when a writer uses a word to mimic a noise. For example, in the description intercoms crackled, the word crackled captures the actual sound made. Word choice. Denotation is what a word literally means. For example, the skull is the bone structure in your head. Connotations are the ideas or feelings that a word might suggest. For example, a skull conjures up thoughts of fear, mortality, and death. For example, slender, slim, thin, lean, and skinny may all have similar meanings, but their connotations can be either negative or positive. Figurative language. A simile is a figure of speech that's used to draw comparisons between two different things. In a simile, something is said to be like something else. For instance, life is like a box of chocolates. A metaphor is a literary device that describes something as something else or suggests a likeness between one thing and another. We typically use metaphors to draw comparisons or when we want our writing to have a strong impact. An example of a metaphor is, "It's raining buckets." Personification is a figurative device in which human attributes or feelings are given to an inanimate object or thing as if it were human. It's a technique that's used a lot in both speech and writing. An example would be, "The snowflakes danced in the cold winter breeze." Read the question. As you read the question, highlight or underline the parts of the source you need to look at, the skills you need to demonstrate, and the focus of the question. Use the key words in the question to structure your answers. This will help you stay focused on what the question is asking about. Annotate the text. To annotate, underline or highlight a significant feature in the text and make a short note about why it is important. For each feature you underline, make notes about what the writer has done, how they have done it, and why they have done it. You then have everything you need to write up each note as a well-organized paragraph. Using evidence. You will need to use carefully chosen evidence from the sources to support each of your points. Use the shortest possible quotation that supports your point and include quotation marks. Make sure your evidence supports your point and enables you to explain your ideas. Let's also not forget the PEED method. It is a method for writing the paragraphs of an essay, excluding the introduction and conclusion. Point. Make a point to answer the question you have been given. Example. Then give an example from the text. Explain. After that, explain how your example backs up your point. Develop. Finally, develop your point. This might involve saying what the effect on the reader is, saying what the writer's intention is, linking your point to another part of the text, or giving your own opinion.